high in the snow-laced silence of the Rockies. Something moved, a shadow, limping, too small to survive alone. Most would never see it. Most would walk past, hearing only wind. But Clara McBride heard something else, a cry wrapped in pine needles and frost. When she stepped outside that morning, she wasn't looking for company. Grief had made her a ghost in her own life. But what she found, crouched beneath the trees, a lynx cub, trembling, wounded, was more than just wild. It was an echo of everything she'd lost and everything she might still heal. Some rescues go both ways. The wind carried a sound she couldn't name. At first, it was just the creak of trees shifting in early morning light. The Rockies do that, breathe differently just before dawn. Clara McBride knew their rhythms. 40 years of living in the timberline taught her the difference between a snapping branch ordeal and a cry for help. This wasn't either. It was high-pitched, raw, not the shriek of an owl or the bark of a fox. It came in short bursts, like someone trying not to be heard, but needing to be found. She stepped onto the porch, wool shawl wrapped tight, steam rising from her chipped enamel mug. Below her, the woods were still wearing their night. Mist drifted through the pines like forgotten smoke, and somewhere beneath it, something moved, something small, injured. Then another sound, a short, sharp exhale, followed by the crunch of ice-crusted needles. Clara squinted through the trees. Nothing, but the silence had changed. Down past the edge of her clearing, tangled between root and rock, lay a shape not meant to be alone. Fur matted in places, its breath visible even from a distance. The lynx cub couldn't have been more than 5 months old. Its coat, once the silver-tipped camouflage of mountain-kin, was dulled with blood and dirt. One front leg curled awkwardly beneath it. The ear tufts, those beautiful wild fans of instinct, trembled with each breath. Clara didn't move, not yet. The cub didn't either. For a long moment they stayed like that. Two broken things on the edge of something neither could name. Then the cub blinked. Once. Slowly. Clara lowered her mug, gently set it on the porch rail, and whispered into the mountain air. "Where's your mother?" No answer came. Just the cold. But even before her feet touched the frozen grass, she already knew. It was gone. Whatever had loved him into this world had not survived the night. The old ranger cabin stood at the far edge of Pine Creek Valley, just where the mountain dipped into a basin of spruce and blue bunch wheatgrass. It was the kind of place people forgot existed. Until winter cut off the roads, and the only light left was the one that burned behind Clara McBride's windows. She hadn't meant to stay this long. After the avalanche, after her daughter was taken by something as fast and senseless as snow, Clara had only meant to visit. A few weeks, a season, maybe. But grief settled deep, and the cabin, once a field station, became her sanctuary, or her cell, depending on the day. It had been 7 years she had learned to move quietly through her days. Each morning began with tea brewed in a dented kettle poured into a mug that had once belonged to Lacey. Pale yellow, chipped at the rim. It had tiny elk on the side, painted with just enough whimsy to feel like a child's gift. It was the only thing she let herself hold on to. She didn't keep pets. Didn't garden, didn't own a television. The only noises that filled the house came from the old floorboards or the wood stove sighing into the night. And that suited Clara just fine. Noise made things echo. Echoes reminded her of laughter. Outside, the land was unforgiving, but she preferred it that way. She knew where the wolves denned in spring, how to track snowshoe hares by the soft V pattern of their back legs. She had once catalogued lichen species along this very ridge, scribbling in field journals now packed into boxes in the attic. Now she walked for different reasons. Each afternoon she followed a familiar trail down to the creek, testing the ice, watching the water's edge. It was always the same. Stillness, broken only by the flutter of a grouse or the startled dash of a deer. Clara didn't mind. Stillness meant she was invisible. Stillness was safe. But the morning she found the blood changed that. It was a single drop, not more than a speck. Dark and half frozen on the wooden steps of her porch. Clara stared at it for a long time before she bent down, fingers trembling. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew what it meant. Something had come close. Something had trusted the light. She followed the tracks, not deep, but fresh. Faint indentations moving toward the tree line, zigzagging as though the animal had limped. A wildcat, she guessed, not a house cat or a feral stray. These were wider, with that distinct snowshoe spread. Could have been a lynx, though it was rare to see one this close to the cabin. Even rarer to find one alone. As she walked, Clara's eyes scanned the trail like they used to when she wore a government badge, when she taught interns how to read bent grass or the story in a broken twig. She saw hesitation in the tracks, long pauses, a dragging mark from one paw, and then nothing. The trail disappeared into a patch of dense underbrush, where snow had fallen heavier. She crouched, listening. Her breath came out in soft clouds. The forest around her was hushed. Then came that sound again, not quite a mew, not quite a cry, a whimper. Clara turned, heart tightening. She didn't see it right away. The lynx cub blended with the bark and frost like it was born of both, but there it was, tucked against the base of a ponderosa, just out of reach of the wind, watching her. Clara froze. Its body was too thin. The ears, those tall, the black-tufted ears, drooped slightly. One paw curled protectively against its chest. And the eyes, they weren't frightened, just tired, too tired to be afraid. "You poor thing," she whispered, her voice almost cracking from disuse. She didn't approach, not yet. Instead, she sat, right there in the snow, no more than 10 yards away. Let her presence settle in like morning fog. For 20 minutes, they simply existed together. A woman wrapped in flannel and wool, a lynx cub wrapped in instinct and pain. Then when her knees began to ache and her fingers went stiff, Clara stood slowly. "I'll leave some food," she said, not knowing if the creature understood or even cared. She turned and walked back to the cabin. But behind her, the cub did not flee. And that night, as the wind howled across the ridge, Clara left a small bowl by the woodshed, boiled chicken, and a single blanket, folded carefully beside it. She told herself it was temporary. She didn't believe it. By the third morning, the bowl was empty, not torn apart, not scattered like a raccoon's aftermath, just licked clean, and left precisely where she'd placed it, as if in silent thanks. Clara didn't speak of it, not out loud. Words made things too real, and she wasn't ready for real. But that morning, something shifted. The sky was cloudless, the kind of brittle blue that only comes when the temperature plunges well below freezing. Clara wrapped her coat tighter, boots crunching through the frosted grass as she stepped outside with the bowl. Her breath puffed in pale bursts. She didn't expect to see him. But there he was, not hidden this time. The lynx cub sat near the shed, half in shadow, half bathed in the gold light of early morning. The wounds were easier to see now, a faint gash above the eye, a limp that made each movement deliberate. But he looked up when she approached, not with panic, just calm watchfulness. Eyes like moonlight, pale, wide, unreadable. Clara's chest ached. "You came back," she said softly, her voice cracking from the cold or from something older. "Or maybe you never left." She set the bowl down again. Chicken, warmed slightly, a few shreds of boiled potato. She backed away just as she had before, giving him space. He didn't move at first, just watched her, unblinking. Then, as if weighed down by the effort, he pushed himself upright and limped forward, each step slow, measured, painful. But he ate. Carefully, quietly. As Clara stood still, not daring to shift even her weight, she realized something strange. He wasn't just eating to survive, he was eating in her presence, accepting her nearness as part of the ritual. That's when she knew he had chosen this. He could have taken the food and vanished, disappeared into the endless folds of the forest. But he hadn't. He had returned to her, to the porch, to the food, to the quiet, and something inside Clara broke open. She crouched, not close, just low enough to meet his gaze across the short stretch of snow-dusted ground. He didn't run, didn't growl. A single flick of his ear was the only acknowledgement. "Are you alone?" she whispered. "No mother? No others?" Silence answered her, but there was grief in his posture. That kind of animal stillness that only comes after a loss too big to understand. The way his body stayed low, cautious, like he expected nothing good from the world anymore. Clara exhaled slowly. It was the same posture her daughter had once shown as a child, curled into herself on the hospital bed after the biopsy. Fragile, angry, still pretending she didn't hurt. She had seen it before. Clara rose and stepped back, not far, just enough to let him finish his meal in peace. She turned and entered the cabin, leaving the door cracked slightly. That night, she lit the old kerosene lamp and left it glowing in the front window. It flickered in the cold wind, casting a soft orange haze onto the snow. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat in her rocking chair, listening to the fire pop, waiting for nothing in particular. But sometime past midnight, when the wind stilled and the night turned velvet, she heard the faintest sound. A soft scuffle outside the door, a breath, then silence. She rose quietly and stepped to the window. He was there, curled beneath the porch awning, just outside the pool of lantern light, head on his paws, sides rising and falling in slow rhythm. One ear flicked when she moved the curtain, but he didn't lift his head, safe, asleep. For the first time in years, Clara felt something not quite joy, not quite peace, but close. She left the door ajar, just in case. By the end of the week, he had a name. Ash. Not for the color of his fur, it was more silver than grey, but for the feel of him. Like something smoldering long after the flame had gone. Like the soft remains of something fierce. He never asked for the name, but he didn't reject it either. That was enough. The mornings settled into rhythm. Clara would rise before the sun, boil water, and set a tin plate of food just outside the porch. She never approached directly. Ash needed his space. He would wait until she stepped back inside, then emerge silently, limping just slightly less than the day before, to eat in the hush of dawn. Some days he stayed after, lingered beneath the window as if listening to the whisper of her kettle. Other days He disappeared into the trees, his tufted ears vanishing into a swirl of pine. But always, he came back. She started talking to him, not in full sentences at first, just fragments, observations, little things. "Snow's coming early this year." That old pine finally gave out, should have seen the squirrel's face. "I'm out of chicken, guess you're getting salmon tonight." She didn't expect him to understand. That wasn't the point. The point was sound. The point was sharing space with something still breathing. Clara hadn't spoken aloud like that in years, not since Lacey. After the avalanche took her daughter, the house had become silent, purposefully so, as if speaking might unmake what little was left. But Ash changed that. He didn't demand, he didn't intrude, he simply was. Present and unafraid. By the second week, Clara began leaving the door open longer, just a crack, enough for scent and sound to drift. One morning, when she sat by the wood stove, knitting, a hobby she hadn't touched in years, she heard the soft thud of paws on the porch. Then the creak of the old floorboard by the step. Then nothing. When she looked up, he was there. Ash stood just past the threshold, one paw lifted, eyes wide, ready to flee at the first wrong movement. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Instead, she returned her gaze to the yarn, fingers moving slowly, deliberately, as if knitting could bridge the chasm between them. After a full minute, he stepped forward. 1, 2, 3 slow paces. And then he settled by the hearth, curling into himself with that same quiet elegance all cats seem born knowing, wild or not. He stayed for an hour, watching, listening, dozing, and Clara didn't cry. Not exactly, but her throat tightened in a way it hadn't since she stood at Lacey's gravesite, holding a pressed flower in her palm, unable to speak the eulogy she'd written. Ash stirred something deep, not just memory, not just grief, hope, but it came slowly, as all healing does. The days grew shorter, snow fell in thick, wet blankets. Ash grew stronger, his limp fading, his coat thickening for winter. He played, occasionally, in that half-wild way of Lynx kittens, batting at pine cones, chasing flurries of snow, kicked up by his own paws. Once, Clara watched from the window as he pounced on a shadow, mist rolled through a drift, and stood shaking snow from his ears like a drenched dog. She laughed, out loud, a strange, brittle sound that startled her more than him. Ash looked up, ears swiveling, then returned to his hunt. The cabin changed too. Clara found herself lighting candles at dusk, boiling broth for no reason, playing the old wind-up radio she'd once tucked away in grief. It played static and mountain gospel, but she let it fill the space. She even pulled down a box from the attic. Inside were Lacey's old books, field guides, a worn poetry collection, and a child's drawing of a lynx labelled Snow Ghost in messy, colourful letters. Clara traced the paper's edge. "You'd like him," she whispered. "You always did love the misfits." That night, Ash slept on the braided rug by the wood stove, tail curled around his nose. She didn't try to touch him. That would come later, if at all. Trust wasn't a thing you earned with wild things. It was a thing you honored. But he was there, and she was no longer alone. Then came the moment. It was subtle, so quiet she almost missed it. Clara had just refilled his plate with bits of rabbit stew, humming softly under her breath, when Ash did something unexpected. He approached, not the food, but her, stopped just a foot away, ears low, body still, and then he lowered his head, pressed it gently against her calf, a soft touch, a gesture more vulnerable than any word. Clara froze, then slowly, so slowly, She reached down and let her fingers brush the thick ruff of fur between his ears. Ash flinched, but did not retreat. She let her hand rest there, feeling the quiet thunder of his purr, low and unsteady. He stayed. And in that moment, something shifted. Not loudly, not in any way that could be measured, but deeply, permanently. She wasn't his owner, he wasn't her pet. They were simply two beings who had known loss, and who, in the deep quiet of a pine cabin on the edge of nowhere, had decided, for just a while, to face winter together. The storm came without warning. It began as a hush, the kind that falls before the mountains exhale something heavy. Clouds gathered low and fast, dimming the already brief afternoon light. By the time Clara stepped onto the porch with Ash's evening meal, snowflakes were spinning sideways, pelting the cabin in angry, swirling gusts. "A squall," she muttered, tugging her wool hat down and scanning the edge of the forest. "You'll want to stay inside tonight, Ash." But Ash wasn't there. Not on the porch, not beneath the woodpile, not curled against the stones of the hearth where he'd taken to napping after dusk. She checked the trees. Nothing. A flicker of unease moved through her. Ash never missed dinner. She stepped down into the thickening snow, calling low under her breath. "Ash, come on, sweetheart. Not the night for wandering." No answer came, only the wind howling like something wounded. Clara moved in slow, careful arcs across the clearing, her boots sinking deep. She checked his favorite places: the shed's hollow, the bend in the creek where the ice cracked softly in spring, the dense thicket near the eastern ridge where deer sometimes bedded down. Nothing, no movement, no sound, just snow, swallowing the world whole. Panic didn't come all at once. It crept. Small thoughts wrapped in larger shadows. What if something happened? A mountain lion, a trap, a fall. He was still just a cub after all. Even with his strength returning, he was fragile in ways he didn't yet understand. By nightfall, the storm thickened into whiteout. Clara had no choice. She returned to the cabin, lit every lamp, stoked the fire high, and left the door open longer than she ever had, just in case. But he didn't return, not that night, not the next morning. The food froze untouched on the plate. Clara hardly slept. Her dreams were muddled: snow, eyes, an empty bed by the fire. She woke with a start to the brittle silence of morning. The storm had passed, the sky blindingly clear. She left before breakfast. The snow had blanketed the landscape in soft white, pristine but fragile. It told stories if you listened. She followed the tracks, his tracks, barely visible near the edge of the clearing. They led south, not toward the creek or his usual trails, but deeper, toward the high ridge. She moved quickly, heart pounding. It wasn't long before she found the signs. Blood, not much, just a few drops, like rust stains against snow, but enough. There were claw marks too, fresh, scored deep into the bark of a downed spruce, scattered fur, tufts of it, silver grey, ash. But also something else, larger prints, wider gait. Clara crouched, examining the snow with a naturalist's eye. A predator, possibly a coyote, or worse, a cougar. Her breath caught. The forest was still, too still. She followed the trail for another half-mile before it vanished entirely. A scramble of disrupted snow, a spatter of blood leading nowhere, and then nothing, like he had been erased. Clara stood there, knees trembling beneath her wool slacks, breath sharp in her throat. "Ash," she whispered, "where did you go?" Only the wind replied. She searched until her legs gave out, until the sky turned from morning blue to bruised dusk and the shadows grew teeth. But Ash was gone. That night, the cabin felt too wide. She didn't light the lantern. She left the hearth cold. Instead, She sat in silence on the edge of the bed, fingers curled around the last bowl he'd touched, still holding the shape of his hunger. The next few days passed in slow spirals. Each morning, she checked the clearing, left food, walked farther than the day before, called his name into the trees until her voice turned hoarse. Each night, she returned alone. The grief surprised her. It wasn't the sharp grief of death, not yet. There was no body, no finality, just absence, the cruel, whispering kind of loss that hides between breaths and says, maybe, maybe, maybe. The lynx cub had become more than a guest, more than an animal. He had become presence itself, a small, breathing answer to a question she didn't know she'd been asking. And now he was simply gone. After a week, she stopped putting out the food. It sat uneaten in the snow, turned to slush by the afternoon melt. She packed away the extra blanket from the porch, rolled up the rug he used to sleep on, folded his plate into the drawer beneath the sink, but she didn't seal the door. Not yet. On the 9th day, something changed. The snow had melted back enough to reveal fresh earth in spots. Pine needles, browned and flattened, peeked through along the trail. And on her walk, still ritual, even in Hope's absence, Clara saw them. Paw prints, clear, deliberate, deep, heading toward the cabin. She followed, heartbeat fluttering. They led past the old spruce, past the hollowed stump, right up to the porch. There, in the half-shadow beneath the bench, she saw something. A feather, long, grey, tipped in black. Lynx fur clung to it like static. Clara knelt, heart thudding in her ribs. She picked it up. It was warm, and suddenly the wind carried more than just cold. It carried the faintest sound, light, deliberate steps across the snow. A soft scrape near the shed. She turned, and there, stepping from the trees like a ghost called home, was Ash. Thinner, a new scar near his jaw, but alive. He didn't bound toward her. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, eyes catching the last of the light, and blinked once. Slowly. She blinked back, and just like that, breath returned to her body. Not joy, not yet, but the promise of it. The light was dying when he collapsed at her feet. Ash had followed her back to the cabin slowly, his gait uneven, his head low. Clara walked 10 paces ahead, afraid that if she looked back too quickly, he'd vanish like a dream in daylight. But he didn't. He followed, up the porch steps, through the open door, into the fire-warmed hush of the old ranger cabin. And then he fell. No cry, no panic, just a soft surrender of limbs and breath and weight. As if the effort of surviving had been spent in that last return. Clara dropped to her knees. Ash! His sides heaved, ribs rising too fast. His flanks were streaked with dried blood. His left hind leg bent wrong. She reached toward him, and for the first time, he didn't flinch. Her fingers found the wound before her eyes did, a rusted snare trap, half buried in the thick fur around his haunch. It clung like a cruel hand, metal jaws still partly clamped. Oh, sweetheart, she whispered, voice shaking. What did they do to you? She moved with the precision she hadn't used since field days. Calm hands, clean blade. She snipped the remnants of the wire, pried open the rusted latch, and eased the trap away with the gentleness of someone mending a broken clock. Ash let out one sound, small, breathless, and then nothing. She worked for hours, cleaned the wound, wrapped the leg in bandages torn from her flannel nightshirt. Boiled snow water to flush the infection, talked the whole time, not for him, but for herself. You didn't deserve this. You came back anyway. I'm right here. When it was done, she sat beside him on the floor, her knees aching, her palms raw. Ash didn't move, but his eyes stayed open, watching her, not with fear, with trust. And Clara wept, not in shuddering sobs, just quiet streams down her cheeks as she rested her hand against the thick ruff of his neck.
"I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. "I thought the mountain had taken something else." Ash blinked, slow and deliberate. The fire crackled. Night deepened. When she finally rose, she fetched a thick wool blanket and spread it over him like a promise. "You stay," she said. "You rest." And he did. In the morning, Ash stirred. He stretched slowly, cautiously, then limped toward the hearth. Clara had already laid out food: boiled chicken, a few spoonfuls of broth.
He ate in silence, then returned to the rug and curled back into himself. Days passed like this, small movements, gentle words, the house shrinking to a shared rhythm. Clara began leaving the front door open again, not because she wanted him to leave, but because he needed to know he could. Freedom, she believed, wasn't something you gave. It was something you respected. But Ash didn't leave. He explored, limped around the cabin, investigating cupboards and corners. Once, he tried to scale the bookshelf and knocked over a framed photo of Lacey. It fell face down onto the rug. Clara picked it up. The glass hadn't cracked. She looked at her daughter's young face, smiling wide beneath a ranger's cap, a lynx paw print on her shoulder, inked the week after her first solo wildlife rescue. Clara smiled, then set the photo upright again, this time next to Ash's food bowl. "You two would have gotten along," she said softly. "Stubborn little wild things." Ash healed slowly. The leg remained stiff, but he learned to compensate. His gait shifted. He moved with the caution of an animal who'd learned pain, but his spirit never dulled. Each day he tested more ground. By the third week he followed Clara onto the porch. By the fourth he stepped into the snow again, limping but steady. Clara watched from the steps, her heart caught in her throat. He paused at the tree line, turned, their eyes met. Then he disappeared into the trees. The cabin was quiet that night. Clara didn't cry, not exactly. She lit the fire, brewed her tea, placed the photo of Lacey by the window, and whispered, "He's ready now." She didn't expect him back. She didn't need him to return. That had never been the point. But at dusk the next day, when the sky burned orange behind the ridge, there was a sound on the porch. Not a knock, just the soft shuffle of paws. She opened the door. Ash stood there, damp from snow, a pine cone clutched in his mouth. He dropped it at her feet. A gift. She laughed, genuine and whole, and picked it up. "You bring me weird things now, is that it?" Ash blinked, tail flicking once. She let him in. That night, he curled beside her on the couch. She read aloud from Lacey's old poetry book, voice quiet, each word a thread pulled gently through time. Ash slept through most of it, but at one line, he stirred. "The wild is not what we fear, it is what we forget." His paw twitched in sleep. His breath deepened. And Clara closed the book. Outside, snow fell again, soft and clean. Inside, the fire whispered. And for the first time in years, Clara McBride fell asleep with something pressed close to her chest that wasn't memory. Spring in the high Rockies doesn't arrive with warmth. It comes with softness. The snow doesn't melt so much as it loosens. It gives way in patches, beneath tree roots along south-facing slopes, between stones that have held their frost for months. The river begins to speak again in murmurs beneath the ice before the sun finds it fully. Clara noticed it in the way the wind changed, less bitter, more curious. The silence shifted too, still present, but no longer mournful. more like a space held open. Ash had been slipping into the woods more often now, not for hours, but for longer than he used to. Sometimes he came back with traces of mud on his paws, pine needles caught in the thick rough at his neck. Sometimes he returned with nothing but a deeper stillness in his eyes. That look young creatures get when instinct begins whispering louder than comfort. Clara didn't try to stop him. She left the door open when he was gone. Not wide, just enough. Just like before. One morning she awoke to a strange quiet. Not alarming, not sad, just different. The hearth was still warm, the room still held the soft scent of broth and pine sap. But the air had a weightless hush, like something had been lifted. Ash's blanket was untouched, the bowl half full, the door slightly ajar. She stepped outside, boots crunching against the last of the frost. The clearing was damp with melt. Patches of earth peeked through, rich and dark. Above, the sky was silver and gold, a spring sky heavy with shift. There were no prints, no sounds, no Ash. She waited all morning, brewed tea, knitted for the first time in weeks, left his plate by the porch, nothing. By sunset, she followed the trail down past the creek. It was softer now, the trail, less treacherous than in winter, but it held no answers, no tracks, no blood, no sign of distress, just absence. She stopped at the bend where the water pooled between two large stones. It had been one of his favorite places, the shadows cool, the moss just starting to reawaken. Clara crouched beside the water and pressed her hand into the damp earth. No paw print, just the memory of movement. Ash had gone, on his own, no violence, no suffering, only choice. And Clara understood he had healed. The wound in his leg, yes, but more than that. The ache that had brought him to her porch, the longing that mirrored her own. Whatever had bound him to the cabin, to her fire, to her quiet routines. It had run its course. She walked home with slow steps. That evening, she didn't cry. Not because she wasn't grieving, but because grief had changed shape. It had become gratitude. She lit the lantern and placed it in the window. Not as a beacon, not anymore, but as ritual, as continuity. "I won't wait," she whispered to the room, "but the light will stay." Days passed. She returned to her work, sorting old journals, cleaning the storeroom, planting the first herbs in little clay pots. She read aloud, still. Sometimes to the empty room, sometimes to the photograph of Lacey. The one that now sat above the hearth alongside a small wooden carving she'd made of a lynx cub with two big paws. The silence had changed again. It no longer echoed, it filled. And then he returned. Not in the way she had dreamed. No sudden reappearance, no soft paw at the door. Just signs. A tuft of silver fur on the porch rail. A smoothed spot in the pine needles beneath the aspen tree. And finally, one morning, near the end of May, she found it. A pine cone, placed carefully atop the rail, upright, balanced like a gift. Next to it, two paw prints, sharp, whole, confident. Clara didn't call out, didn't move. She picked up the pine cone and held it in her palms, still warm from sun or body. She couldn't tell which. Then, for the first time in months, she walked back into the cabin and opened every window. Let the wind in, let the light find every corner. The past would always be here. But now, so was something else. A life that had touched hers, briefly, wildly, gently, and left her more whole than before. Sometimes the most lasting connections are the quietest. They don't arrive with ceremony. They don't leave with warning. They drift in like mist over the pines, unseen at first, then suddenly everywhere. Ash had been such a presence, not loud, not demanding, just real.
Soft-footed and watchful, a creature who brought healing not by fixing what had been broken, but by sitting beside it, patiently, until it no longer hurt to breathe. Clara no longer searched the tree line each morning, but she noticed more. The way the light hit the porch at noon, the tracks near the ridge that weren't there yesterday, the low hum of bees waking in the thawing bark. The mountain still held its solitude, but it didn't feel like loneliness anymore.
She had learned that love, especially the kind given by wild things, is not something to grasp. It is something to witness, to meet, moment by moment, with reverence. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it leaves behind a pine cone on your porch, a gift, a reminder that even the untamed carry tenderness, even the lost can find their way. And sometimes, when the world is quiet enough, we hear them arriving just when we need them most. If this story touched your heart, stay close. Here on Paw Prints and Stories, we believe some bonds never end.